I think all fiction is underhand. People use the strangest and most personal things and people close to them. I think the fiction that doesn't do this often displays a sort of fatal weakness. It's just made up.
Herzlich willkommen zu Hansa Rauschen, dem Literaturpodcast des Hansa Verlages. Mein Name ist Florian Kessler. Hier sprechen alle 2 Wochen Lektorinnen und Lektoren mit Menschen aus der Welt der Bücher, mit Schreibenden und Lesenden, mit Leuten von anderen Verlagen und aus dem Haus. Es geht um alles, was in Bücher passt und außenrum passiert. Und das ist wirklich nicht wenig. Der Hansa Verlag hat seinen ziemlich schönen Sitz im noblen Münchner Stadtteil Bogenhausen, am Herzogpark, nur 400 Meter entfernt von dem Ort, an dem Thomas Mann mit seiner Frau Katja und den Kindern von 1914 bis zum Exil aus Nazi-Deutschland 1933 lebte. Bereits vor einigen Monaten hatten wir nun im Verlag Besuch von einem Schriftsteller, der sich sehr für diese Orte Thomas Manns interessierte. Der große irische Autor und Intellektuelle Colm Tóibín war auf Recherchereise für einen Roman, den er über Thomas Mann schreibt. Der 1955 geborene Tóibín hat in seinem Werk bereits viel über andere Kreativität und andere Biografien nachgedacht. Unter anderem gibt es den berühmten Roman Porträt des Meisters in mittleren Jahren über Henry James von ihm, der wie sein gesamtes Werk bei Hansa auf Deutsch von Giovanni und Titte Bandini übersetzt wurde. In diesem Jahr kam bei uns auf Deutsch sein großer Roman Haus der Narben heraus, in dem er sich kopfüber in die antike Orestie stürzte und sie wie neu erzählte. Sein Lektor Piero Salabé hat das Gespräch nun aber genutzt, um nach der Recherche für das im nächsten Frühjahr kommende Buch über Thomas Mann zu nutzen. Wie recherchiert man so etwas eigentlich? Wie geht ein Schriftsteller wie Colm Tóibín beim Recherchieren vor? Viel Vergnügen mit Hansa Rauschen.
Colm, thank you so much for having this conversation with you. My first question, Colm, what have brought you to Munich, in fact, these days? We are in a beautiful, it's a beautiful summer day. Why have you come to Munich?
I've been writing a novel about Thomas Mann, and of course the city is filled with his ghost.
I mean, you have been working on this project for a long time. I think then you can tell us more exactly how many years. But how come this being fascinated by Thomas Mann?
It's a great story because it includes so much secrecy and silence. That in other words, here he was, one of the most respected men in Europe, arriving in America, his voice being the voice of the sort of gravity of an old Europe that somehow would survive the Second World War and emerge once more as a sort of humanism. Someone who had put deep thought into the ideas of decline and ideas of also a sort of illness which he works with in so many books, especially with The Magic Mountain, being in some way or other a sort of metaphor for a much larger illness within the society. But this man having very secret sexual desires, which emerge in a text such as Death in Venice, and emerge also in his diaries, but were not known. It was not something that he exploited or that he spread news about. And so that he has within himself secret desires, but also secret losses.
We will talk about him a little bit later. Just to remark one thing, you have written a novel about Henry James. Now you're writing one about Thomas Mann. These were called in German the Künstlerroman. It's novels about artists. It's a kind of genre you have especially in the 19th century. But if I go back and look at your beginnings as a writer, you have on the whole written very, very different books dealing with women a lot, being protagonists of women in family ties that are oppressive. But also you have written books on biblical subjects like the Testament of Mary, now House of Names based on the Oresteia, and many books, many subjects. How did you begin writing? How was that? You were a young man and you wanted to be a Künstler, an artist yourself, and you just struggled your way through, or you were a journalist? And
I began as a poet. That was what I really cared about, and I still do.
But you're not writing poetry?
I write about one poem every year.
Oh.
sometimes 2.
Send it to us.
And then I became a journalist, and then an idea for a novel came to me. And I've been attempting to work with short stories and finding it very difficult. And so really that wasn't working. And I was quite content as a journalist, but the idea for a novel came to me. And I suppose, like anyone, it's a lot of work over a long period of time. It requires persistence and dedication. And you really have to be ready for it, because you're halfway through you think, oh my God, do I have to do more of this? Part of the problem is that as a novelist, you by the time you've written half a book, you know the rest. You're really almost familiar with it. And writing it is not that interesting because you know it. So that you really have to transform the act to an act of communication rather than an act of self-investigation or an act of is doing something that pleases you. You think, this has nothing to do with me. This is for them. This is for somebody I will never meet. And so that it becomes this mysterious need to communicate. And that's what a novel eventually does.
Your first novel was The South, which was taking place in Spain. And you yourself, I've read, went to Spain after reading Hemingway, having a kind of fantasized idea of that country. What was that experience so fundamental for your career as a writer?
Yes, I suppose it was. I went there in September 1975, and Franco died in November 75. There's no connection. I didn't have anything to do with his death. So what happened was that the society changed very quickly.
Completely different.
Yeah, very quickly political parties formed.
And did you notice parallels between the Catholic Society of Ireland you were leaving and entering this country who had such a long time of very rigid Catholic rule?
It was the differences that affected me. Catalan Catholicism isn't like Southern Spanish or Castilian Catholicism. There's a big tradition of anti-clericalism, anarchism coming from the 19th century. So it wasn't a walking into a religious society that I recognised. It was a nationalism I recognised, the feeling somehow that one has been oppressed, that the language has been oppressed, that identity has been oppressed, and that as a little country who's held out against large forces, and it gave rise to a sort of an emotion that if someone sang a song, even a love song in Catalan, people would almost tear up because they would think about Catalonia. And people loved Catalonia, thought we were a person.
Yeah.
And I recognised all of that. In a way that I had to say, English people and Americans who were in Barcelona at the same time had no understanding of. But I
because of the Irish background.
Yeah, because of the Irish background, I understood it immediately. I had really no difficulty with it.
All the same, in one of your stories in The Empty Family, one of your last books of stories, you have a story with very explicit scenes of love scenes, erotic scenes, like liberation, kind of. Was this the atmosphere of those years?
Yes, you see, in 1975 in Barcelona, there was no gay bar. So think about that. I mean, there was nowhere for gay people to go. So, of course, it wasn't as though Franco died and then everything changed. People had changed in the 5 or 6 years earlier. Whatever way the society ran, so that there was long hair, there was an idea of sexual freedom, there was people were smoking dope, people were reading strange books, listening to strange music, and I was an innocent Irish boy. I was 20 years old, and I began to go to this apartment in Plaza Real in the middle of Barcelona, where if you were lucky some nights, they had orgies. And I've never before since been at an orgy, but they were very nice and very sweet and innocent, and anyway, it was a big change.
What is the story called again? The title?
It's called Barcelona 1975.
Okay. Yeah. Let's talk about your first novel, The South. Yeah. And in this novel, the protagonist, Catherine Proctor, is the first heroine in a series that follows in your books. I mean, Nora Webster, and then the protagonist of Brooklyn, Mary, Clytemnestra, somehow. How come that you are so interested in this female world? And I just make a remark because I have seen a documentary on Almodovar, and he was put exactly the same question. Why always these women? I mean, what's happening? And he answered in this way, which didn't convince me personally. He said, you know, if you talk to a man, a common man, he would tell you very little about his emotions. Whereas if you talk to a woman, even to the least woman in town, she would have an enormous sentimental life, which for him appeared terribly interesting. This was his idea. But why do you choose so often this perspective?
I think there are a number of things. One is that if you repress somebody or a group of people, and certainly women were oppressed, and then they have to speak, or they have to emerge into light, they will do so with much more texture and flavour than the people who have been oppressing them, who will tend to act and speak with much more restraint and much less texture. The second answer would be, I think it must have something to do with being gay, and the idea of gender being fluid for me. And
but Flaubert was not gay, or was he?
No, and in Ireland, for example, novelists such as John McGahern, whose first novel has a female protagonist, Brian Moore, whose first novel has a female protagonist, James Joyce, who ended Ulysses with an astonishing monologue from Molly Bloom. So it's not that unusual in Ireland. So it may not be, it may not be all the result of being gay, but I feel some of it is. But also the second part, which I think Almodovar is right in that there was something much more interesting about women as they changed their method of dress, or as they began to speak, or as they began to emerge into light, that you could see something and dramatise something much easier than some grumpy old farmer who had nothing much to say.
In your work, we have some novels concentrating on man, like Henry James, obviously.
And there's a novel, The Heather Blazing,
which
is the second novel I wrote.
Very strong in your novels is family ties. You have written even essay collections, New Ways to Kill. Was it your father?
Your mother. It could have been your father, which just turned out to be your mother.
Yeah. Then you wrote this book on the three fathers of Irish writers.
Yeah.
Joyce and Wilde and Yeats, I think.
Yeah, Yeats. Yeah.
So, how come you're so interested in this relationship of within the family?
It seems to me a great dramatic subject, because you have ties that are blood ties, and then you have ties that are social ties, and you have moments where the blood tie, the whole idea of nurturing, taking care of, has to just disappear, and people have to start treating their children as adults. But that often doesn't happen, or happens in a strange, gnarled way, and it's different. So that there's always a drama there. There's always something to look at there. So that, in the case of Thomas Mann, his relationship to his wife, his 6 children, his sisters, his father, his mother, are all relations that really do dominate him, much more, say, than friendships, which he doesn't really have, but he keeps everything within the family.
You were saying at the beginning that after you have written half of a work, or let's say a novel, the next problem is the communication aspect. If you look back from the first novel to this project, how has your style evolved in your own opinion?
Oh, I don't think it's evolved at all.
Because you were talking about communication.
I suppose I'm more aware of what it is that I do too easily, and I need to vary that and work against it. But I don't think the work has changed very much. I think if you look at that opening section of the South, and look at the opening of the Testament of Mary, that you'll find
parallels.
I mean, you know, this is a style that obviously was always there. It's like a DNA style.
Yeah.
And I think if you look at the opening of the Heather Blazing, which is much more sort of modestly set, it's set in a, you know, in a small seaside place in Ireland, and the style sort of attempts to capture Irish weather. You know, the sort of no big storms, no big waves, but you know, small waves and just generally bad weather, drizzle rather than rain.
Yeah.
That style will come up again in Nora Webster.
Yeah, and maybe I had this impression because the subjects of your works are so different. You know, from the Künstlerroman to, you know, description of petit bourgeoisie in Ireland to the completely different also social situations that you describe. And if you look at a tradition that particularly influenced you in the novel writing, in the writing of novel, because just to add, you're a polygraph. You write about many authors. It's really impressive, and as readers we're grateful for the immense scope of your interests, from poets, figure from culture, and so one wonders who. Obviously Henry James must be someone who influenced you.
I think it begins somewhere in Flaubert, in the Three Stories, or in Madame Bovary, and it makes its way in odd ways through Stendhal, Zola to some extent, and yeah, then comes especially into the prose of George Eliot. Middlemarch. Daniel Deronda, for me, would be a very important book. And then, of course, you have this extraordinary flowering of the English novel in a very strangely, a lot of them moved out of London into Sussex, and I'm talking about Joseph Conrad and Henry James, but also Ford Madox Ford, and there are various other figures, including Catherine Mansfield, Virginia Woolf, but just taking Conrad and James, what Conrad did to the English sentence, to the sense of what perception is, and how mysterious it is, and how hard it is to be sure. There's a lovely uncertainty in Conrad. I mean, really, the more the narrative circles a thing, the less you feel you actually know the thing. And he's very good on that idea of the ineffable, the unknowable. And James begins to refine the idea of point of view, that in general in his work there's a single point of view. There's a person who notices, sees, remembers and feels, and that person is rendered in third person singular, which we might call third person intimate, in that we become intimate with that person.
Yes.
We become intimate with that person because we can see things from the perspective, whereas if it's in the first person, its voice, it's the otherness of that voice, which is a tradition that also is there from the 18th century, from a novel like Moll Flanders, making its way right through to something like The Good Soldier by Ford Madox Ford, and in the middle of this you get something like Buddenbrooks. What's interesting then is, as Thomas Mann moves, he fails a great deal. You know, that there are novels that really, no matter what you think of them, you cannot think very highly of them. Novels like Royal Highness, for example.
Königliche Hoheit.
Yeah, that have a sort of, that there is a sort of, there is in man always a battle against his own tediousness. That there are things that you feel that he's just in the study in the morning writing the book without it meaning a great deal to him. Even though Royal Highness was supposedly about Katia, was about marrying a sort of princess, it doesn't have the same sense of writing to rescue his life that Buddenbrooks does, and later on that Dr. Faustus does.
Let me ask you something about inspiration. You were saying about Thomas Mann being not so inspired maybe in Königliche Hochzeit.
And perhaps even in the Joseph novels.
And even there. We'll come back to Thomas Mann in a second, but about this subject of gossip. I've read in Wikipedia, you can read that Comte Tobin doesn't watch television. Is that true?
Yeah.
So that's true. So I wonder, do you use gossip as a means of inspiring yourself for stories? Not intentionally, I mean, or is it just a pleasure thing, or do you practice that? And how could Thomas do it, who was so reclusive?
Oh, I think he was fascinated by other people's lives. I mean, he was fascinated by Alma Mahler. Everybody gossiped about her. And he certainly joined in that. I mean, he wasn't reclusive in that sense. He was a social man. He did not have his he'd have his meals on his own. There were constantly people.
Carefully,
yes, he did. And yes, it seems to me that the business of listening, of just it doesn't happen very much, but every so often someone will tell you something, and you just think that is very interesting, very interesting, and you don't even need to write it down. And you end up using things all the time.
We wonder, as readers of your work, and all the articles you write, the books, how can you find those moments of precious concentration, being a polygraph, writing so much and in so different places?
Don't overestimate the. I mean, this is not a. I teach one semester a year, and I teach on Mondays and Tuesdays, and that's all for 14 weeks of the year. So that the rest of the time you have a full day free. In other words, you wake in the morning, you think, I don't have anything to do today. I don't have any.
How many emails do you receive a day?
And actually, oddly enough, not that many. But the thing is, you can deal with that as a lovely, in other words, you spend the day just pushing yourself to finish whatever it is you've started. And if you want to stop for an hour, you can just reply to emails for that hour. And also, after a month of doing that, you can't go on. If you've written, recently I wrote 2 new chapters of the Thomas Mann book. But notice I'm here now, I'm not writing today, because I just needed a month where I'm not writing and where I'm doing other things. Because when I go back to it, I want to have a whole lot of new ideas and a whole lot of new ways to see the book. So that it's actually not that hard, and it's just a question of, I think it's a lot of times making sure that you just develop habits. And one of them has to be that as soon as you're awake, as soon as you're up, you go to the desk and you work at something.
Is there any author or books of this author you carry with you when you're in the creative process? Or are you of that kind of author who says, no, I don't, it's too many voices around me that is...
Oh, I wouldn't bother me at all. In other words, if somebody said, look, I need you to write, no, I'm just not... I'm not susceptible. I'm not vulnerable in that sense.
Yeah. And there is.
And I know writers say that, and I never believe them. Oh, when I'm writing, I can't read another book. It just sounds pretentious and untrue.
It does. But there are, on the other hand, authors who look like a special atmosphere. What you were saying before about the sentences of Henry James, or something you feel in tune with, and you think, this is what I need to read now in order that my work goes on. Is there something like this, or not really? Depends on the project, probably.
Yeah, but I'm also reading all the time. So so I'm involved all the time.
But I suppose that now you're reading a lot of Thomas Mann original work.
Yes, I go back. Yes, I go back to. I go back to the work all the time, looking for things.
Yeah. Let's talk about this parallel between maybe Henry James and Thomas Mann. I've read a sentence you said about your Henry James, that his life was a drama of renunciation. Have you said this, or?
Oh, I have. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Would you say that Thomas Mann's life has also this drama?
James and Mann have a good number of things in common. One of them is that they were the second brother in a family of 5, with the older brother being athletic and sort of boy who came home with mud on his boots. And that was Heinrich Mann and William James, who also were very talented as writers. And the second brother is much more in the kitchen with his mother, or is a much more sickly sort of person, and it's going to take enormous amount of effort for him to emerge into the light, away from the shadow of his older brother. Also that both of them had, that both of them now, if they were alive, would be called homosexual. And then they had a sexuality which they effectively submerged. And so this extraordinary repression occurs within the self, and perhaps emerges in the work where there's such an amount of, so many Henry James plots depend on people committing adultery. But it's not, adultery is a big word, I mean that people wanting each other in ways which are forbidden. And James deals with this in The Wings of the Dove, The Golden Bow, Portrait of a Lady, The Ambassadors, this whole idea of what's forbidden, of a secret that if it emerges. And of course we find this in a way it's all over, it's all over Buddenbrooks in a really submerged sort of way, a strange sexuality that's going on in the book that nobody is really talking about or dealing with. And it comes up again in say, Death in Venice, or The Blood of the Volsungs. Yeah. It comes up again in certainly in The Magic Mountain. It's filled with the mixture of sexual desire and illness, and
Tristan,
of all of these people together. Tristan, Tonio Kroger, and also Dr. Faster. So it's filled with that. But both of them lived long and productive lives. In other words, there's a feeling sometimes that they submerged elements of themselves and into work, into the work, extraordinary production. So, in case of both, also of writing essays. So they became vastly industrious, and also hugely secretive. So there is a great deal that I think connects the two of them, and I mean also the way they were photographed as looking like enormously serious men of the world. There was a worldliness about both of them. They both liked money, for example, and they both knew about money.
One aspect one can ask about your book on Henry James is how legitimate is the fact that you sort of identify with a real person, a real author who has existed. I quote one sentence of, I think it's the 4th chapter of your James book, where Goose remained nervous, knowing how much he had contributed. He insisted that writing a story using factual material and real people was dishonest and strange and somehow underhand.
Yes.
You do this with James,
yes.
Maybe you do it also with Thomas Mann. I have heard one author, I don't tell you the name, she's British, saying, I don't want Colm Tobin telling me how Henry James feels. Why haven't you chosen a completely different name or setting?
I think all fiction is underhand, and that people use the strangest and most personal things and people close to them. I think the fiction that doesn't do this often displays a sort of fatal weakness. It's just made up, and it shows the sort of thinness of what's made up. That's not true all the time, but I'm fascinated by the connection between life and the book, so that my reading is part of my experience as much as how I love, or who I know, or who I family I belong to. My reading, I live in my reading, and therefore emerging from that experience has been an attempt to imagine in some detail the lives of two particular writers who have obsessed me. Not merely writing about their work, but trying to see in the way that I work, which is to imagine scenes, to see moments, to try and see what their lives might have been like. And obviously if you want to know And I look at the word know. If you want to know what happened to him, that's not a problem. There are all these biographies up, and go and read them. But I'm trying to give you something else, some idea of what an imagined version of that story might be. And of course it's fraudulent, of course it's underhand. And of course someone who's interested in fact, and I'm not surprised this is somebody English. I mean, somebody who's brought up in a tradition of positivist thought, of positivist philosophy, as opposed to, say, metaphysical thought, or indeed religious thought, might have a problem saying, well, I like my bread buttered. Someone who has a notion of how they want life to be ordered. Well, I don't have any notion of how I want life ordered, but so that I don't feel any great responsibility to the facts here. I merely will use them for my own purpose. Okay. And yes, I can see what the problem is. And my job is to overcome that, is to, once you start the book, I introduce you to a character who is the fictional invention of mine called Henry James. I want you to follow this, yes. And I want you to forget all your own prejudices and all your own opinions, and just follow the book. Now, obviously some people don't want to do this because, of course, some people prefer to read history than fiction at all, on the basis that all fiction is just foolishness, on the basis it's what children do. And the whole point, that they make up stories. Adults do not do this. Adults tell the truth. Well, ha, is my answer to that. Ha.
Well, I think not only William Shakespeare with his historical plays, but also Goethe wrote a play on Tasso, which is in fact a Künstlerroman. So there is an enormous tradition behind that.
Yeah, and Christopher Marlowe wrote Tamburlaine, and you say, well, if I want to know about Tamburlaine, well, where would you go? Well, I suggest you try Christopher Marlowe, actually.
Very well. Let's talk again about this aspect of sexuality, hidden sexuality. The Pope said a famous sentence, "Who am I to judge a homosexual?" No one knows what he meant by that, but that sentence was important for many people. Now I ask you, why is it so important? Suppose, because I don't know where the evidence is, even the entry of a diary can be an evidence, but yes, I mean, a diary can also be something, made up, whatever. But how is it so important to investigate and suppose sexuality in your work?
Oh, I think that part of the problem about being gay is it's not like the problem of being Jewish or Irish.
I mean also generally, not only the homosexuality.
Well, just let's take the problem of being gay, is that there's no history. That it isn't as though the 14-year-old will immediately be able to identify with a group of people who are his or her people, as a Jewish kid would, or as an Irish kid would, say, or as an African-American might, that the history is not there and obvious. So creating a dotted line to the past, to say that there was a different way of being homosexual in 1890 than there is now, and we have to understand the pressures on people. We also have to be able to read carefully the secret code of homosexuality in these years, what it looked like. And we can often get it wrong because something that looks like homosexuality, in the case of, say, Robert Louis Stevenson, may in fact be something else entirely. So we have to be constantly engaged and guarded and subtle, because these things are not easy to read. But every time we come across a case of somebody living a repressed life as a homosexual, there's always a sign given. In the case of Thomas Mann, the sign is particularly strong because it comes in Death in Venice, and therefore, and it also has 6 children. So we have to be, it isn't as though this is a simple example. So I'm fascinated by it for that reason.
It is incredibly.
If it weren't so complex, I wouldn't be interested in it.
Yeah, but also Shakespeare was said, the famous sonnets and so on.
Yeah.
So, what is the sense of, supposing that Shakespeare was maybe a repressed, closeted homosexual?
See, I think with 16th century homosexuality, we really have much less to go on Because if we look at the laws, if we look at, but there are other ways to study it, which is, for example, Shakespeare's sonnets, to realise that things may have been much more fluid than we know from official documents. So this is the reason why poetry becomes so important here. The drama for me of somebody who has to be on guard every single moment, with every single gaze or glance, whose desires cannot be consummated, and who every moment is living a life where desire is something that has to be repressed. Well, I'm interested in that. I can dramatise that in a way I cannot dramatise simplicity.
Exactly. But this would be more or less the same with a heterosexual couple. Let's say, imagine a monogamous man.
Yeah. No.
Who would always be tempted by...
Yeah. No, that's a completely different thing, because in the first place, the idea of desire is fully accepted by everybody. And the idea then of desire that has to be repressed because of monogamy and marriage. But I'm talking about
social constraints.
Yes, but I'm talking about also the idea of what happens when you're 16 or 17 and you realise that the very thing you want is utterly forbidden, and you must not mention it, and you must fully repress it, which does not happen to heterosexuals. I mean, there may be repressions later on. There may be ways that you have to obviously live within a marriage that it may not be fully satisfactory. But with homosexuality, it's much deeper, where the very business of desire itself must be repressed, and that can never happen without consequences.
There is an important book by a German poet and also scholar called Heinrich Detering. He has studied a lot Thomas Mann, maybe you know him, and his book is called The Open Secret. The subtitle is The Literary Productiveness of a Taboo like Homosexuality, and he analyzes it in Winkelmann, in Thomas Mann, in many other authors, Kleist, Heinrich von Kleist, in the German literature. So the question is, if that hidden and secret world of desire was productive in the terms of, literary terms, how can one judge or consider the new wave of LGBT literature, which is all over the place now? Is this is maybe this productiveness, will that disappear in a future time, or how do you consider that?
I think that writing from the, say, 60s onwards, in figures such as Jeanette Winterson, Edmund White, Alan Hollinghurst, has made an enormous difference. In other words, it's not written for silence. It's not written into silence. It's written for an audience, and an audience sometimes who desperately need these images. We begin with Adrienne Rich's suggestion that as a gay woman, when she looked in the mirror, she saw no one. There was no image of her available to her. And as the gay movement has grown, as gay consciousness has grown, so too the need for an image to appear that reflects you. And that's why the cinema has been so important. But that's also why the books of David Levitt or Edmund White or the other people I mentioned. So it's a different idea.
It's a political discourse, also self-liberation.
Yes, but in the case of someone like Hollinghurst, because of his talent, it's an astonishingly literary adventure where he's exploring an underground to some extent with these absolutely astonishingly beautiful sentences and cadences and ways of noticing and observing distinctions. And so he is, I think, a really...
This openness can also bring new, more interesting ways of expression.
I think there are infinite numbers of ways of handling this now. And also, there are some places where there's no liberation gone on at all. There are the next places where you could write a Jane Austen novel about a gay relationship. Will they, won't they? I think that there's a huge amount of of territory. What I'm interested in now in this is the idea that you're talking about from that book of what happens when a secret becomes open. If writing itself is a way of opening secrets, if the extraordinary industry of these figures arises from some desperate need not to tell and some need equally urgent to say. So that tension could actually manage to produce very interesting work.
Yes, yes. I mean, this is obviously also your interpretation, I think. There is this famous work by Michel Foucault, The History of Sexuality, where he analyzes how the idea of sexuality arose in our society, especially in the 19th century, being the term sexuality an ideological term. And if you read the last paragraph of his book, he says that this ideology of sexuality has somehow taken the mystery out of what before was called eros, which was many, many things. And the sexuality has this strong, also biological underlining. So he ends that work with a sentence. The irony of this deployment is in having us believe that our liberation is in the balance. So there is an irony in this idea that self-liberation has to go through discovery and definition of sexuality. Is this something you might agree with?
Well, I wonder if Foucault's analysis ends up being a Parisian one, and that the sense that the excitement being taken out of eros might arise from living in a great cosmopolis where people had been up to these things for a very long time, and there had been all sorts of traditions of secrecy and openness going on at the same time. But at the time he was writing, you really could do anything. And that therefore none of it had the same excitement as when you were forbidden from it. But coming from Ireland, it just didn't look like that. And it still doesn't. I mean, for me still, things remain very exciting for me still, sexually. And so when I read about people saying, oh, something erotic is over, I think they might mean...
Not erotics.
Yes, but the sort of strength in erotic that they might have associated with a previous time. I come from that previous time, I'm afraid. I mean, it mightn't be all great, but it does still remain very strong. The excitement, the newness.
I don't think... Well, I'm not sure that the excitement is he's addressing the excitement. I think it's the ideology behind that. But, categorization and all that, which sort of lessens the mystery.
He's certainly right about that. If you look at James Baldwin's novel Another Country, written before Stonewall, everyone's gay. I mean, everyone's capable of going to bed with everyone. It's quite exciting that Vivaldo ends up in bed with so and so, and that so. And once Stonewall came, then the categories began, and especially the category of not being gay became a much more significant category than being gay. So it meant there were men who would never ever dream of having any same-sex relationship. I think this has changed back. I understand.
So it was better when it was worse.
Well, everybody says that. Everybody says...
that was more freedom without the names, the categories.
Gord Vidal told me that the most sex ever had in the world, and the best sex, was in a YMCA in New York circa 1944. Because all of the soldiers were back in, some just for a week. And they were going back out again to war a week later. And there was no time to develop relationships with girls. The girls were elsewhere anyway, and suddenly they were all together, and they could do anything, like knowing that this might be the last thing they would do. And he said that people had the wildest, most wonderful sex in that week, because there was no category. There was no one bothering them about were they gay, because there was almost no future. And Yeah, so the
I
categories have...
This happens also with feminism. You think from a political point of view, I think many or most people would underline it is necessary to have the quota and all that stuff. But from a very human point of view, feminism is also a kind of ideology that was necessary in order to provoke the liberation and justice within our world. And so these names were necessary. But when we talk of literature, everything is more fluid and less categorized.
Yes, I mean, I think that's interesting where there's been a movement in America with figures like Chris Kraus, Maggie Nelson, Sheila Heti, who actually just want to speak, the idea of speech itself, of the first person singular, of actually the writing coming from the self. You know, in the end you go back to Virginia Woolf and...
That's it. If you could choose, because you mentioned those two figures also as a strong contrast in your Henry James novel, Henry James and Oscar Wilde.
Oh, James.
Of course, James. So it's the repressed one, not the liberated one.
Yeah, I can see Wilde very clearly.
Yeah. How do you mean you can see him very clearly?
I mean, it was an open book. By the end of his career, one saw everything that he had done very clearly. With James, that's not true. He remains a mystery.
Very good. Come, I have two last questions, because we're talking about Ireland. I had this review by Tony Eagleton.
Oh, what did he say?
Con Tobin is an ambivalent figure in this respect, a well-known revisionist, who nevertheless brings, like his heroine, from rural Wexford, from a spot within its a much-sung revolutionary history. That was a quote.
Yeah. You know, I don't take a stand. I'm a novelist. I'm not an ideologue. I'm not a Marxist. And Terry's a Marxist and is an ideologue. And so that we would always have differences. And my ambivalence, I would consider the most necessary thing I own. And I would suggest that he try that too, but that's another question. But what he's referring to here is, when he's talking about revisionism, is Irish revisionism, which is to do with looking at the period of 700 years and attempting to I suppose, make the narrative more complex. And allow the narrative, with all its nuances, to appear. In other words, if you say only a single thing happened in Irish history, which was the British invaded and the Irish resisted, that's not only not true, but it's not useful. In other words, if you look at any given year, there are many more strands involved. And so you need to complicate the narrative. And so that's what I was trying to do in a number of essays I wrote, to see if there's a way to complicate the narrative.
James' life was a life of, you said, a drama of renunciation, which means that somehow the missed life flowed into literature. What do you lose, Colm, by writing?
Nothing.
Absolutely nothing?
No.
So
there's no point in getting, into areas of self-pity or worrying, about, oh, I have given up so much for this art. That's all rubbish.
No, I'm not saying in this very pragmatical, Anglo-Saxon idea of I could be someone else as a banker or whatever, but in the sense of, I've heard some authors who I always ask this question because I'm very interested in that, and they were very puzzled by it, because let's put it this way, Thomas Mann could have, spent more hours with his children, which he didn't, because he was always concerned with his work, and so he couldn't really, give many things. I know it's a very arbitrary question somehow, but in your case, you would say nothing.
Nothing.
One last remark. Marcel Reich-Ranitzky, the famous German critic, was asked what was the most important scene in literature for him in the 20th century, in the German 20th century literature, and he said it was the moment where Taju and Gustav von Aschenbach meet, you know, I think it's on the beach in Venice, and he renounces. That was, in his opinion, the most important scene. How do you consider this?
It's good. I mean, there are a lot of good scenes. You see, I think that this business of saying what is your top 10 books, or what is your
well, it's not the question. This is obviously a bit silly, but I mean,
I think
the statement is.
It's a very interesting. It's a very interesting,
saying no.
He's right in that it's a very, very interesting moment, and you can see Mann's problem when he set up the story. How to get out of that story is the hard. I mean, because is he going to masturbate, for example? And Mann is not going to go there with that. Is he going to follow him? Is he going to attempt to touch the boy? Is he going to all the things that you think? No, I cannot do these 10 options. There has to be a moment of realizing that this the building up of all this desire is for the purpose of saying that this desire must be renounced, and so it's a very natural way out of the story. There isn't an alternative.
From the technical point of view, but from the point of view of what you were mentioning before, metaphorically seeing temptation, obviously in that case seeing homosexual desire as a danger, and renouncing to it.
What's really important here is that Katia is not only his first reader, but she is sometimes his only reader in that it isn't as though he really has to be careful with her in this time, because her family is going to read, everyone around is going to read it, and he has to give her something, and this is what he gives her. Yeah.
I think that Reich-Ranitzky meant by that what happened later, temptation in political sense, can be renounced. That there is a moment where, renouncement can mean civilization, basically.
Yeah, I mean, the problem about Mann, publishing that around 1913 is that he's about to have a pretty grim 5 or 6, 7, 8 years where he gets the First World War so wrong. I mean, and it's still a mystery over why he becomes such a Prussian in 1914. Just some idea of the Germany surrounded by its enemies, all of that paranoia gets to Mann, which of course makes him such a crucial figure later on, because he learns just how dangerous those emotions that he himself felt were. And these emerge in that unreadable book called Reflections of a Non-Political Man, which he delayed the Magic Mountain to write, but also in the argument he's having with Heinrich, and in the letter exchanges, and in the exchanges in public he's having with Heinrich. So his position on anything from about 1913 to 1923 is really strange, and the idea that he had 6 children annoying him during this period makes it even stranger.
When was the turning point politically?
I would think about 22, 23. Yeah.
Was it due to the figure of Adolf Hitler, because he simply...
Yeah, it was even before that.
Was it ideology, or...?
Yeah, I think it was even before the figure of Hitler. I think it was the realization that it was that the militarism and that the surrounded by your enemy idea really could lead only to trouble, and he became a different man. And my theory would be that this was done under the influence of his wife, very, very carefully throughout these years. Once she was out of the sanatorium, once she was back there, that she began to move him politically.
Oh, really?
Towards him. Well, that would be my version of the story. Yeah.
Colm, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Gideon. Thank you.
Das war es für heute mit dem Podcast Hansa Rauschen. Das waren viele Worte für viele interessante Dinge. Bis zur nächsten Folge und danke fürs Zuhören.